The year was 1976, and the bustling streets of Los Angeles held no promise for a struggling actor who was down to his last few dollars. Living in a tiny apartment with barely enough money for food, Sylvester Stallone clutched a worn notebook containing his dream, a screenplay he'd written about an underdog boxer named Rocky. Few people knew that before becoming the legendary action star we know today, Stallone faced one of his toughest battles not in the ring, but in a courtroom. This is the story of how a young actor's determination turned mockery into triumph, proving that sometimes real life mirrors the very movies we cherish. Back then, Stallone wasn't the household name he would later become. He was just another face in the crowd, taking bit parts in B-movies and struggling to make ends meet. Despite having appeared in a handful of films, including The Lords of Flatbush, success seemed to dodge him at every turn. But Stallone had something that set him apart, an unwavering belief in himself and his script. The story takes an unexpected turn when Stallone found himself in court over a dispute with his former landlord. The issue wasn't just about unpaid rent, it was about damaged property and a security deposit that the landlord refused to return. For most people, this would have been a straightforward small claims court case. But what happened next would become part of Hollywood legend. As Stallone stood before the judge, dressed in his best but clearly worn suit, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The landlord's attorney, a well-dressed man with an expensive briefcase, smirked as he presented his case. He painted Stallone as just another failed actor in a city full of them, someone who couldn't pay his bills and was trying to scam his way out of responsibility. When it was Stallone's turn to speak, he began explaining his situation with the same passion he'd poured into his screenplay. But before he could finish his first sentence, the judge interrupted him with a laugh. "So, you're an actor?" the judge asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "And what exactly have you been in that I might have seen?" The courtroom erupted in muffled laughter, and Stallone felt the familiar sting of rejection he'd experienced countless times at auditions. But instead of shrinking away, something inside him sparked to life. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about dignity. "Your Honor," Stallone began, his voice steadied despite the humiliation, "I may not be famous yet, but I've written a screenplay. It's about a man who gets one shot at his dreams and refuses to give up, no matter what anyone thinks of him." The judge's amused expression didn't change, but Stallone continued, undeterred. He explained how he'd been living on barely anything, putting every spare dollar into pursuing his dream. He detailed how he'd kept the apartment in good condition despite its pre-existing problems, and how the landlord had ignored repeated requests for necessary repairs. As he spoke, his natural eloquence began to shine through, and the smirks in the courtroom gradually faded. What the judge didn't know was that just weeks before, Stallone had turned down a $300,000 offer for his Rocky screenplay, an astronomical sum for someone who could barely afford to eat. The studio had wanted to cast a well-known actor in the lead role, but Stallone had insisted on playing Rocky himself, even though it meant accepting far less money. This was the same determination he now brought to the courtroom. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Stallone concluded. "I'm just asking for fairness. The same fairness that every person in this courtroom deserves, regardless of their profession or bank account balance." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge, who had been taking notes, looked up and studied Stallone's face. The laughter was gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked like respect. He began asking detailed questions about the apartment's condition, the timing of repair requests, and the documentation Stallone had brought with him. As the hearing continued, it became clear that Stallone had meticulously documented everything, from photographs of the apartment's condition when he moved in to copies of maintenance requests that had gone unanswered. His attention to detail surprised everyone in the courtroom, especially those who had been quick to dismiss him as just another struggling actor. The landlord, who had been so confident at the beginning of the hearing, began to shift uncomfortably in his seat. His attorney's attempts to discredit Stallone's evidence fell flat in the face of such thorough documentation. The same judge who had laughed at Stallone earlier was now nodding thoughtfully at his explanations. What made this moment particularly poignant was that while Stallone was fighting for his rights in this courtroom, his screenplay, Rocky, was slowly making its way through the Hollywood system. Unknown to everyone present, including the judge, this man they had laughed at would soon become one of the biggest stars in the world. The day wore on, and as the final arguments were presented, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely transformed. The initial mockery had given way to genuine interest in the case's details. Stallone stood his ground with the same quiet determination that had carried him through countless rejections in his acting career. As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, he paused and looked directly at Stallone. The same man he had laughed at hours earlier now commanded his full attention. What happened next would prove that sometimes, the greatest victories come when we refuse to let others' laughter define us. The story of that day in court would later become a small but significant chapter in Stallone's journey to stardom. It represented everything that his character Rocky stood for, the belief that with enough determination and dignity, an underdog could rise above any challenge, whether in the ring or in a courtroom where laughter turned to respect. The judge's verdict that day would become a turning point, not just in the case, but in Stallone's life. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge began, his earlier mockery replaced by professional respect, "I find in favor of Mr. Stallone." The courtroom fell silent, but the story was far from over. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not only Stallone's future but also change how Hollywood viewed underdogs forever. The judge didn't just rule in Stallone's favor, he ordered the landlord to return the full security deposit plus additional damages for failing to maintain the property properly. But it was the judge's closing remarks that truly captured the essence of this moment. "Mr. Stallone," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions based on prejudices that have no place in this courtroom or anywhere else. Your preparation and presentation today have been exemplary." As Stallone gathered his documents after the hearing, the landlord's attorney approached him. "You know," the lawyer said, adjusting his expensive tie, "you might have missed your calling. You could have been quite good in law." Stallone smiled and replied, "Thanks, but I've already found my calling. Sometimes you just have to wait for the world to catch up." Little did anyone know that at that very moment, across town, executives at United Artists were reviewing his Rocky screenplay for the final time. The courtroom victory had given Stallone a renewed sense of purpose, reinforcing his belief that standing up for oneself could lead to unexpected victories. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. While dealing with the aftermath of the court case, Stallone was also in negotiations about Rocky. The studio executives, initially skeptical about letting an unknown actor take the lead role, were starting to see the same determination in Stallone that the judge had witnessed in court. Word of his courtroom performance began circulating through the local legal community. Several law firms even reached out with job offers for paralegal positions, amused and impressed by how he had handled himself against a seasoned attorney. But Stallone remained focused on his true passion, bringing Rocky Balboa to life. The parallels between his courtroom experience and Rocky's story weren't lost on him. Both were about underdogs fighting against a system that had written them off. The judge's initial laughter had echoed the same dismissive attitude Rocky faced from the boxing establishment. And just like his character, Stallone had fought back with dignity and determination. As he walked through the streets of Philadelphia during Rocky's pre-production, Stallone couldn't help but reflect on how the courtroom incident had strengthened his resolve. The experience had taught him something valuable about standing up to authority figures who underestimate you, a lesson he would draw upon repeatedly throughout his career. The casting director who had initially doubted Stallone's ability to carry the film began to see something different in him after hearing about the court case. "There's a kind of authenticity in someone who fights their own battles," she remarked during a production meeting. "Maybe that's exactly what we need for Rocky." During this time, Stallone's former landlord attempted to appeal the court's decision, claiming the judge had been too lenient. This led to a second hearing, but this time, things were different. The same judge who had once laughed at Stallone now presided over the appeal with a notably different attitude. The landlord's new strategy was to paint Stallone as an opportunist who had manipulated the court's sympathies. But the judge wasn't having it. "I remember this case well," he interrupted the landlord's attorney. "Mr. Stallone won not because of sympathy, but because he had the facts and the law on his side. This second victory proved even sweeter than the first." The appeal court not only upheld the original decision but increased the damages award, citing the landlord's frivolous appeal as grounds for additional penalties. The message was clear: persistence and truth would prevail. Meanwhile, Rocky's production was gaining momentum. The same determination Stallone had shown in court was now evident in every aspect of the film's development. He threw himself into training, transforming his body while still refining the script during late-night writing sessions. The story of his courtroom victory had begun circulating through the film crew, adding an extra layer of respect to their interactions with him. The production assistant who had been there during the court case often told others, "You should have seen him. He stood there like he was born for it, just like Rocky in the ring." As filming progressed, Stallone incorporated subtle elements from his legal battle into the movie. The theme of being underestimated, of fighting back with dignity rather than anger, became even more prominent in the script. Every time Rocky faced doubt or dismissal in the story, Stallone drew from his own experience of turning mockery into respect. The judge, who had no idea about Rocky at the time of the trial, would later see the film when it was released. In a remarkable twist of fate, he sent Stallone a letter after watching it. "Now I understand what you meant that day in court," he wrote. "Sometimes our greatest victories come from simply refusing to stay down." As Rocky began filming on the streets of Philadelphia, Stallone's courtroom victory started having unexpected ripple effects throughout the entertainment industry. Word had spread about the unknown actor who had stood up to a judge and won, transforming mockery into respect. This reputation began opening doors that had previously been firmly closed. One particular morning, while Stallone was preparing for a crucial scene, a veteran producer visited the set. He had heard about the courtroom incident from a friend in the legal community and was intrigued by the parallel between Stallone's real-life fight for respect and the character he was bringing to life. "You know," the producer said, watching Stallone rehearse his lines, "what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about a security deposit. It was about something bigger." He paused, letting his words sink in. "It was about a system that's quick to judge, quick to laugh, but slow to recognize real talent." The producer's words struck a chord with Stallone. He realized that his courtroom experience had fundamentally changed how he approached his role as Rocky. Every time he played a scene where Rocky faced doubt or dismissal, he drew from the raw emotion of standing in that courtroom, facing a laughing judge. During this time, something unexpected happened. The court clerk who had been present during both hearings came to watch the filming. She had been moved by how Stallone had handled himself in court and wanted to see him in his element. What she witnessed that day would later become another piece of Hollywood folklore. The scene being filmed was the famous sequence where Rocky runs up the museum steps. Take after take, Stallone pushed himself, much like he had done in court when presenting his case. The clerk noticed something fascinating. The same unwavering determination she had seen in the courtroom was now visible in every take, every run up those steps. As news of Rocky's production spread, reporters began digging into Stallone's background. One ambitious journalist discovered the court records and attempted to spin it into a negative story about a struggling actor who couldn't pay his rent. But the narrative quickly shifted when both the judge and the court clerk came forward to share what they had witnessed. The judge, who had initially laughed at Stallone, gave a rare interview. "In all my years on the bench," he said, "I've never been so wrong about someone at first glance, and never been so glad to be proven wrong." His words would later be quoted in numerous articles about Stallone's rise to fame. Meanwhile, the landlord who had triggered this whole saga watched from the sidelines as his former tenant's name began appearing in entertainment news. He attempted to capitalize on the situation by offering interviews about the real Stallone, but his efforts backfired when the full court transcripts became public, revealing how thoroughly Stallone had proven his case. The filming of Rocky continued, but now with an added layer of meaning. The crew noticed that Stallone brought an unusual intensity to scenes where Rocky faced skepticism or ridicule. When asked about it, he would simply smile and say, "Some things you can't act, you have to have lived them." One day, during a break in filming, Stallone received an unexpected visitor. It was the landlord's attorney from the court case. The lawyer had been following the news about Rocky and wanted to see for himself what was happening. What he witnessed that day changed his perspective completely. "I've been practicing law for 20 years, the attorney admitted, watching Stallone prepare for a scene, and I've never seen someone turn defeat into victory quite like you did. You didn't just win the case, you won respect." These words would later appear in several books about Stallone's journey to success. The impact of the courtroom incident continued to resonate throughout the production. When it came time to film the climactic boxing match, Stallone insisted on making it as realistic as possible. He wanted the audience to feel the same emotions he had felt in that courtroom, the determination to prove oneself against all odds. During this time, a young film student who had been interning at the courthouse during the original hearing wrote a paper about the parallel between Stallone's real-life courtroom battle and Rocky's fictional fight. The paper would later become required reading in several film schools, analyzing how real-life experiences shape authentic storytelling. As Rocky neared completion, Stallone received another letter from the judge. This one was different from the first. "I've been thinking about that day in court," the judge wrote, "and I realized something important. Sometimes our greatest mistakes, like my laughing at you, give others the fuel they need to prove us wrong. In doing so, they don't just change their own lives, they change everyone around them." The letter deeply moved Stallone, who was now seeing the final cuts of Rocky. He understood that his courtroom experience had given him something invaluable, a real-life understanding of what it meant to be underestimated and to fight back with dignity rather than anger. The crew working on Rocky's final editing noticed something remarkable. In scenes where Rocky faced dismissal or doubt, there was a subtle but powerful authenticity in Stallone's performance. "It's like he's not even acting," one editor remarked. "It's like he's reliving something real." As Rocky approached its release date, the story of Stallone's courtroom confrontation began taking on a life of its own. Film industry insiders who had initially dismissed him as just another struggling actor were now paying attention. The parallels between his real-life court battle and Rocky's fictional journey were too compelling to ignore. One afternoon, while overseeing the final edits of the film, Stallone received an unexpected phone call. The court reporter who had transcribed his hearing wanted to share something remarkable. "You know," she said, "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen someone turn a judge's laughter into admiration quite like you did. The transcript doesn't capture it, but I saw something change in that courtroom that day." Her words struck a chord with Stallone, who was now seeing Rocky through fresh eyes. The film wasn't just about a boxer getting a shot at the title, it was about every person who had ever been laughed at, dismissed, or underestimated. His own courtroom experience had unknowingly added layers of authenticity to the story that no amount of scripted dialogue could have achieved. During this time, the landlord who had taken him to court made one final attempt to insert himself into Stallone's rising success story. He approached several newspapers, claiming he had been the inspiration for Rocky's antagonistic characters. However, his efforts backfired when journalists uncovered court documents showing how thoroughly Stallone had proven his case. The judge, who had become an unlikely part of Stallone's journey, attended a private screening of Rocky before its official release. After watching the film, he pulled Stallone aside. "When you stood in my courtroom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I saw a struggling actor. Now I realize I was watching Rocky Balboa himself, a man fighting for his dignity with nothing but determination and truth on his side." This conversation would later become a pivotal moment in Hollywood lore, symbolizing how success often comes to those who refuse to let others' judgments define them. The judge's transformation from skeptic to supporter mirrored the journey many would take as they discovered Stallone's talent and determination. As the release date drew closer, film critics began digging into Stallone's background. Many were surprised to discover the Courtroom story, seeing it as a perfect prelude to Rocky's creation. One prominent reviewer wrote, "Perhaps it took a man who knew what it felt like to stand alone against skepticism to create such an authentic underdog story." The impact of the courtroom incident continued to ripple through Stallone's life in unexpected ways. During press interviews for Rocky, reporters often asked about his inspiration for the character's resilience. While Stallone usually spoke about his struggling years in New York, those who had witnessed the court case knew there was more to the story. A young law student who had been observing cases that day wrote a paper about the intersection of legal justice and personal dignity, using Stallone's courtroom performance as a central example. The paper found its way to several law schools, where professors used it to illustrate how preparation and authenticity could overcome prejudice and preconceptions. Meanwhile, the courthouse staff who had witnessed both hearings organized a special screening of Rocky. They were struck by how many of Rocky's qualities, his determination, his dignity in the face of mockery, his unwavering belief in himself, they had seen firsthand in Stallone during the court case. One bailiff, who had been present during both hearings, later told a reporter, "Watching Rocky, I couldn't help but remember how Stallone handled himself in court. It was the same quiet strength, the same refusal to be beaten down by others' expectations. He wasn't just writing about an underdog, he was one." As Rocky's premiere approached, Stallone received another surprising message. The landlord's attorney, who had faced him in court, requested a meeting. Over coffee, the lawyer made a surprising admission. "I've spent my career representing property owners," he said, "but your case taught me something important about judging people too quickly. Sometimes the person you're dismissing today might be the one everyone's talking about tomorrow." This conversation deeply affected Stallone, reinforcing his belief that success wasn't just about proving others wrong, it was about staying true to yourself when others doubt you. He incorporated this philosophy into his subsequent interviews about Rocky, though few knew its origin in that contentious courtroom. The court clerk who had witnessed the entire saga kept a unique memento from that time, the original docket sheet from Stallone's case. Years later, it would become a sought-after piece of Hollywood memorabilia, representing the moment when an unknown actor stood his ground and began his journey to stardom. During the final days before Rocky's release, Stallone visited the courthouse one last time. Standing in the now-empty courtroom where he had faced ridicule and emerged victorious, he felt the weight of his journey. The same room that had once echoed with laughter at his expense would soon be mentioned in stories about his path to success. The night of Rocky's premiere transformed Hollywood's understanding of Sylvester Stallone. As the credits rolled and the audience erupted in applause, few knew that the authentic portrayal of an underdog's struggle had been shaped by real-life experiences in a Los Angeles courtroom. The film's success would soon bring the courthouse story into the spotlight in ways nobody could have predicted. A week after the premiere, the judge who had once laughed at Stallone received an invitation to a special screening. He arrived expecting to simply watch a movie, but what he witnessed that evening would stay with him for the rest of his career. Seeing Rocky's journey from ridiculed outsider to respected contender, the judge recognized the parallels to that day in his courtroom. During the post-screening discussion, the judge stood up and shared something unexpected. "Many of you see Rocky Balboa on that screen," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "but I saw him long before this film was made. I saw him standing in my courtroom, fighting for his dignity with the same determination you just witnessed on screen." His words caused a stir in the room. Industry executives who had initially resisted casting an unknown actor in the lead role began to understand what they had almost missed. The story of the laughing judge who became a believer added another layer to the Rocky phenomenon, showing how life sometimes mirrors art in the most unexpected ways. Meanwhile, the courthouse where it all began was experiencing its own kind of fame. Law students and young actors would visit, hoping to stand in the same room where Stallone had turned mockery into respect. The court clerk, who had witnessed everything, found herself repeatedly telling the story of that day to curious visitors. "What people don't realize," she would explain, "is that it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about how he won it. There was no anger, no bitterness, just this quiet determination to be heard and respected. The same quality you see in Rocky, we saw it first in that courtroom." The landlord's attorney, who had faced Stallone in court, became an unexpected advocate for giving people second chances. At a bar association meeting, he shared how the experience had changed his approach to practicing law. "Sometimes," he told his colleagues, "the person you're facing across the courtroom isn't who you think they are. They might just be a future star waiting for their moment." As Rocky's success grew, film critics began exploring the deeper layers of authenticity in Stallone's performance. One perceptive reviewer wrote, "There's a scene where Rocky faces skepticism from the boxing commission that feels almost documentary-like in its realism. Now we know why. Stallone wasn't just acting out a scene, he was drawing from real experience." The impact of the courtroom incident spread beyond Hollywood. Law professors began using the case as an example of how prejudice and preconceptions can affect judicial proceedings. One professor at a prestigious law school made it a tradition to show his students the Rocky training montage, followed by a discussion of Stallone's real-life courtroom victory. During this time, a young filmmaker attempted to secure rights to make a documentary about the courthouse incident. While interviewing the security guard who had been present that day, he discovered something touching. The guard had kept a copy of the court calendar from that date, never imagining it would become a small piece of Hollywood history. The judge's transformation became a particular point of interest. In a rare interview with a legal journal, he explained how the experience had changed his approach to the bench. "Every time I feel tempted to make quick judgments," he said, "I remember the day I laughed at Sylvester Stallone. It taught me that dignity often comes in unexpected packages." The courtroom where it all happened began to take on an almost mythical status in Hollywood lore. Young actors would sometimes sit in on proceedings, hoping to absorb some of the energy from where Stallone had made his stand. The bailiff, still working there years later, would occasionally point out the exact spot where Stallone had stood. As Rocky's success continued to grow, Stallone received an invitation to speak at a judicial conference about his courtroom experience. His speech focused not on winning or losing, but on the importance of being heard. In that courtroom, he told the assembled judges, "I learned something that would shape every role I've played since: respect isn't given, it's earned, one moment at a time." The courthouse staff organized a small ceremony to commemorate the case's significance. They installed a small, discreet plaque in the courtroom, reading simply, "Justice prevails where dignity persists." While it didn't mention Stallone by name, those who knew the story understood its meaning. The ripple effects of that day in court continued to influence Stallone's career choices. In selecting future roles, he was drawn to characters who faced similar moments of judgment and prejudice. "Every hero's journey," he would later explain in interviews, "begins with someone saying they don't belong." As Rocky's success continued to soar, the story of Stallone's courtroom victory took on new significance in Hollywood. Production companies began looking differently at struggling actors, remembering how one judge's laughter had almost derailed what would become one of cinema's greatest success stories. The incident became a powerful reminder that talent often comes in unexpected packages. The courthouse itself experienced an unusual phenomenon. Young performers would visit during breaks between auditions, sitting quietly in the back row of the courtroom where Stallone had faced his moment of truth. The bailiff, who had witnessed the original incident, noticed how these visitors would often touch the wooden barrier where Stallone had stood, as if drawing inspiration from that spot. One morning, a surprise visitor appeared at the courthouse, a successful director who had initially rejected Stallone for a small role years before the Rocky success. He wanted to see the room where he believed Hollywood's greatest underdog story really began. Standing in the now famous courtroom, he shared a revelation with the clerk. "You know," he said, looking around the room, "we in Hollywood think we know talent when we see it. But this room tells a different story. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest talents are the ones we laugh at first." His words would later appear in a book about Hollywood's greatest missed opportunities. The judge's transformation became a topic of discussion in legal circles. At a judicial conference, he gave a memorable speech about how the experience had changed his approach to the bench. "That day taught me that justice isn't just about applying the law," he explained. "It's about seeing the humanity in every person who stands before us." During this time, Stallone received an interesting invitation. A group of law students had started a club named the Rocky Legal Society, dedicated to studying cases where underdogs had prevailed against seemingly impossible odds. They asked him to be their honorary first member, seeing in his courtroom victory the same spirit that had made Rocky an inspiration. The landlord who had initiated the original court case attempted to reconcile with Stallone, sending a letter through his attorney. "I never thought my small claims case would become part of Hollywood history," he wrote. "Looking back, I realize I was on the wrong side of something much bigger than a security deposit dispute." The court reporter who had transcribed the original hearing had kept detailed personal notes about the day, capturing moments that wouldn't appear in the official record. She wrote about how the courtroom's atmosphere had shifted from mockery to respect, and how Stallone's quiet dignity had affected everyone present. These notes eventually found their way to a film historian researching the real-life influences behind Rocky. The historian was struck by how many of Rocky's memorable qualities, his resilience, his dignity in the face of ridicule, his unwavering determination, had been displayed by Stallone in that courtroom long before they appeared on screen. A young lawyer who had been inspired by the story began incorporating it into his work with struggling artists facing legal challenges. He would often tell his clients, "Remember Stallone in that courtroom. Sometimes the system laughs at you first, but that doesn't mean you can't win their respect." The courthouse staff noticed another interesting development. Whenever Stallone released a new film, there would be an uptick in visitors to that particular courtroom. Many were aspiring actors facing their own legal challenges, drawing strength from knowing that one of Hollywood's biggest stars had once stood there, turning ridicule into respect. The judge's law clerk from that period had kept a diary, which revealed interesting details about the day's events. "What struck me most," one entry read, "wasn't just how he handled the mockery, but how he transformed it." By the end of the hearing, the same people who had laughed were listening intently to every word he said. As Rocky's influence spread globally, the story of the courtroom incident traveled with it. International film students would make pilgrimages to the courthouse when visiting Los Angeles, seeing it as the place where the real Rocky story began, not in a boxing ring, but in a moment of standing up for one's dignity. The incident began influencing how casting directors approached auditions. One prominent casting director admitted, "Every time I'm tempted to dismiss someone too quickly, I remember the judge who laughed at Stallone. It makes me look twice, listen more carefully. You never know when you might be facing the next Rocky." The court clerk who had witnessed everything kept a particular memory that she rarely shared. After the verdict, she had seen Stallone sitting alone in the corridor, not celebrating, but quietly reflecting. In that moment, she would later recall, "I saw both the man he was and the star he would become. There was something about his quiet dignity that told me this wasn't the last we'd hear of him." Years after Rocky's release, the story of Stallone's courtroom victory continued to resonate in unexpected ways. The incident had become more than just a Hollywood anecdote, it had evolved into a powerful symbol of perseverance that inspired people across different walks of life. The impact of that day in court had created ripples that would influence both the entertainment industry and legal profession for years to come. On the 20th anniversary of Rocky's release, something remarkable happened. The Los Angeles County court system organized a special commemoration of the famous case. The event brought together many of the original participants, including the judge, court staff, and even some of the spectators who had been present that day. The gathering revealed previously untold stories about how that single court session had changed multiple lives. The judge, now retired, shared a personal revelation during the ceremony. That day changed not just Mr. Stallone's life, he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of experience. It changed mine too. For the rest of my career, every time someone stood before me, I remembered the day I almost let prejudice blind me to someone's true worth. A documentary filmmaker who attended the commemoration discovered something fascinating. The courthouse had preserved the original audio recording of the hearing, though it had never been made public. The recording captured something the written transcript couldn't: the gradual change in the judge's tone from dismissive amusement to genuine respect as Stallone presented his case. The bailiff who had worked that day revealed a touching detail he'd kept to himself for years. After the verdict, he had seen Stallone writing something on a small piece of paper. Years later, he learned it was an early draft of one of Rocky's most famous lines about how winning isn't about how hard you can hit, but about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. During this time, a group of law professors began incorporating the case into their curriculum, not just as a story about legal preparation, but as a lesson about human dignity. They noted how Stallone's approach, responding to mockery with quiet determination rather than anger, had created a template for handling professional discrimination. The original courthouse building underwent renovations, and there was serious discussion about preserving the courtroom where the famous case had been heard. Preservation societies argued that the room represented an important intersection of legal and cultural history. They noted how the space had become a symbol of hope for struggling artists facing their own legal battles. A retired court reporter who had been present that day shared her personal notebooks at the commemoration. She had recorded details that never made it into the official transcript: the subtle changes in body language, the shift in the room's atmosphere, the moment when laughter turned to attentive silence. Her notes provided an intimate glimpse into how respect had been earned that day. The landlord's son, now a property manager himself, came forward with an interesting perspective. "My father spent years regretting how he handled that case," he revealed. "It taught our family a valuable lesson about judging people by their current circumstances rather than their potential." The story had a particular impact on young lawyers starting their careers. Many reported that they kept a small picture of Rocky on their desks, not just as a movie memento, but as a reminder of how Stallone had won his real-life legal battle, with preparation, dignity, and unwavering determination. The judge's law clerk, who had witnessed everything, had gone on to become a successful entertainment lawyer. At industry events, he would often share how that day had influenced his career. "I learned more about advocacy in that one hearing," he would say, "than in all my years of law school." As Stallone's career continued to flourish, he occasionally referenced the courtroom incident in interviews about perseverance. He spoke about how the experience had shaped not just Rocky, but every underdog character he'd ever portrayed. The authenticity in these roles came from having lived through that moment of having to prove himself against skepticism and ridicule. The courthouse staff maintained a small, informal museum in a corner of the building, displaying items from that day: the original docket, the judge's handwritten notes, photographs of the courtroom. These simple artifacts told a powerful story about how respect is earned and how success often comes to those who refuse to be defined by others' judgments. During the commemoration, a surprise announcement was made. The State Bar Association had created a new award named after the case. The Stallone Advocacy Award, to be given to lawyers who showed exceptional dedication in representing underdog clients. The first recipient was a young attorney who had helped struggling artists with their legal problems. The story's legacy continued to grow in unexpected ways. Acting schools began using the court case as a teaching tool, not just for its dramatic elements, but for its lessons about maintaining dignity under pressure. Students would reenact the scene, learning how to channel real emotion into their performances. As the ceremony concluded, Stallone himself made an unexpected appearance. Standing in the same courtroom where he had once faced ridicule, he shared a perspective that brought everything full circle. Success isn't just about proving others wrong, he said, looking around the familiar room. It's about staying true to yourself when others doubt you. This room taught me that lesson long before Rocky showed it to the world.